Friends, good to see you again. So, continuing with our composite chart series, let's talk about Neptune in the composite houses. So, Neptune in a composite chart has a double meaning, and it really depends on how you're dealing with Neptune personally, which side of Neptune you will experience, and also how you combine, which side is likely to come up within the relationship. So we can have a lot of clarity occur. We can see through veils with Neptune. It can be a spiritual connection. It can be an unspoken connection. It could be an ultimate sensitivity that we can have together. The other side of Neptune is that we can have delusion. We can have ideals that go awry. We can have disappointment. We can have confusion. We can have deception, self-deception, and also deceiving of each other. A lot of times it's going to be self-deception when we're dealing with Neptune, either personally or in a composite chart. So the house is the area of life, the experiences that are really showing the context for where Neptune is, where those Neptunian actions will be. So wherever Neptune is where we'll have those fantasies and dreams materialize, where we can potentially have clarity or confusion or deception. With composite Neptune in the first house, the chances of confusion or of not understanding what the relationship is actually about are very high. We tend to idealize each other very heavily with Neptune in the first house. Neptune in the first, Neptune in the seventh are one of the more difficult places to have it. So we don't see each other for what we are with composite Neptune in the first. There's a lot of pinning characteristics or ways of being on each other that might not actually be real. So over the course of time, the truth does come out, and there can be a lot of disappointment with Neptune in the composite first house. The other thing that can occur is that we can have very different ideas about what the relationship is, what it's about, what its purpose is, but we can assume that the other person has the same ideas that we have. So that's also another point of contention when we find out that their point of view is very, very different from what we assumed it was. We can also get into some savior behavior, and that's really in service to our own ego and our own personal difficulties. So we tend to use each other as the vehicle to work out our own inner needs, and we can delude ourselves into thinking that we are saving or serving the other person, when in fact it's really enabling parts of our own personality that are not the healthiest. And it's not unusual to see composite Neptune in the first house in affairs or hidden relationships, because there is such a high level of idealization of each other. It makes it much, much more likely that we will get into a relationship that seems to promise us more than it can actually deliver. With composite Neptune in the second house, we have to be very careful about handling our resources and our money and our material stuff in a way that is practical. We tend to spend more on vacations or luxuries or Neptunian ideals and not have enough left over for the necessities of life. So there can be confusion over idealization, even deception, in the area of life where we're trying to put together a nest egg. So there can be confusion about finances, money. That can be where we can find ourselves more insolvent, and it can be harder for us to establish who's going to lead in that area of life. We tend to more turn it over to the other person with the assumption that, they'll take care of it. But there's a lot of assuming going on in the area of life where we're dealing with more the practical details of managing our finances. With composite Neptune in the third house, we can have some difficulty in understanding each other and in really taking in and absorbing the other person's opinions and perspective and point of view. We tend to project our own ideas, our own ideals about the other person's ideas onto them instead of actually understanding them, actually having conversations where we're piercing through those ideals. So Neptune in the third kind of obscures practical communication, and we can have less confrontation when it comes to just laying it out there, just having conversation for the sake of conversation. So we can more edit ourselves, and it just doesn't lend itself to a real natural flow of the sharing of ideas. We can also find disappointment when we come to see that the other person does think differently. That's where we can have the assumptions happen in our own projection of our own opinions and ideas, that we idealize them, so we like them very much because they think like we do, and then we can find out otherwise, and then we can have that colossal disappointment. And that's when we have to go through that Neptunian journey of actually falling in love by discovering who the other person really is. So we have to try to have practical conversation when we have Neptune in the third house. We really have to try to pierce through the veil of our own mental projections onto each other. With composite Neptune in the fourth house, we can idealize home and home life while not understanding what is actually going on in our home and our home life. So it's like we'll dream about what kind of home we'd like to have, or we'll mutually dream about what kind of life we'd like to have, but we're ignoring or not understanding or dealing with current problems that actually exist in our life right now. So it's like instead of confronting what could lead to that more ideal life, we sort of gloss over what is currently happening and just focus on the potentials of that ideal life. So that ideal life isn't likely to actually emerge unless we're confronting and dealing with the things that can set us up to have that. So it's an interesting position because there is a warmth, there is a spiritual connection, there's a real feeling of sensitivity and being intuitively linked when we have composite Neptune in the fourth. But we need to be willing to really deal with any problems at hand so that we really can attain that ultimately secure, unspoken connection that we can feel is there, but it could be more. It could be better, because we always have that idealism that brings us into the future. We can envision something more. It doesn't exist now, but it could. And that's really the meaning of Neptune, is to form a vision that maybe it doesn't exist now, but if we apply ourselves and if we work towards that, it could be the case. So it's an interesting position because it does lend to a sweetness in the relationship, but it isn't a terribly practical place to have Neptune unless we are making an effort to achieve clarity by dealing with whatever destabilizing things are going on currently in the relationship. And if we can do that, then we have a pretty good chance of progressing towards that ideal of that perfect home we'd like to have, or that vision of that family that we would really like to have. Composite Neptune in the 5th house tends to contribute to over-idealization and our feelings running away with us. There's not a lot of practicality with Neptune in the composite 5th house. The 5th house is a fast area of life. It's where we have risk-taking and romance, and things happen quickly. It's a very spontaneous stage there. So with Neptune in the composite 5th, and romance happens in the 5th, the Neptune is high romance. With Neptune in the composite 5th, it tends to lead to the idealization of romance itself. We tend to fall in love with love. So we have to be careful with Neptune in the 5th, because it is such a big dose of sugar. If we have solid things going on in the composite chart, if we are relating to each other as equals too, that's very important to be relating to each other as equals when we have composite Neptune in the 5th, because we tend to want to turn into the Sir Lancelot and save each other, and it is not a healthy thing. So we have to be relating to each other as equals, and it has to be a relationship where there's some amount of groundedness. We want some practicality if we have Neptune in the composite 5th. If we do have a pretty good recipe, if it's, we're tethered to reality, we're it's a pretty good match, our values are in tune, we can definitely survive a composite Neptune in the 5th house. It's not a deal breaker if we have substance in other areas of the relationship. It can keep things fresh. It can keep us being excited about continuing to date over the course of a long-term relationship. It can just increase the liveliness of the romance, and we can idealize each other enough to be able to keep those ooey-gooey visions of each other alive. And, there's nothing wrong with that. Composite Neptune in the 6th house contributes to selflessness and the idealization of service towards others. So we can overdo or over-idealize doing for each other. And it can make for a climate of resentment where we feel like, we're always in service, or we're always depleted because we're doing this, or we're running a dog hospice, and then we're going and we are volunteering at the children's hospital, and it's just it's depleting for the two people. So we have to make sure that how we are extending ourselves isn't actually causing our own health to suffer. How we are trying to help others or to contribute to other people's health, we have to make sure that's not detracting from our own health or from our own well-being, because we tend to influence each other to become more service-oriented and be confused. That's where the confusion, the lack of seeing the totality of a clear picture, it's happening in the context of health and service and giving and such. The other thing that can happen is that we can contribute to each other's quirks, hypochondria, self-criticism. We can heighten that between the two of us. So if we have a tendency towards hypochondria, then we can influence each other in such a way where that can become more of an extreme thing in the relationship. With composite Neptune in the 7th house, we have to be very careful about over-idealizing each other and about equality issues. If we have someone who we're saving, someone who we feel needs us, and we get into a victim-savior thing, then that is a recipe for a lot of unhealthiness between the two of us. So we have to be careful that we're relating to each other as equals and not as, the firm and the infirm. So we have to be careful to evaluate the relationship very carefully when Neptune is in the composite 7th, because we tend to see what we want to see. We tend to project our own inner image of our own perfect partner onto each other when Neptune is in the composite 7th. And eventually we're going to see through that. We're going to see enough evidence of who the person really is to where it pops that fantasy. And then we are completely disappointed and we feel robbed. We feel that we've been deceived by the other person, when really we haven't seen who they were all along. They didn't just start becoming themselves one day. They were themselves all along. We just didn't want to see it. So we have to be willing to evaluate each other clearly with composite Neptune in the 7th. And if we can do that, we can actually have a very good intuitive connection. We can find the relationship to be a source of sweetness and unspoken understanding. And there can actually be a lot of good things that can happen with Neptune in the composite 7th. But that is under certain conditions of clarity. With composite Neptune in the 8th house, we have to look closely at the natal charts to see if we have escapist or addictive behaviors in the natal charts. If we do, we tend to exacerbate those with Neptune in the composite 8th. If we don't have the tendency towards escaping, then we can experience confusion, and this would be in addition to the other things as well, but separate from that. We can have confusion about resources, confusion about what should or should not be insured, confusion about ownership. Neptune is an impersonal and non-material force. And when it's in the 8th house, it breaks down the greed that is found in that area of life. So it tends to dissolve the sort of our grip on possessions and our need to keep or hold on. So we can find our stuff or our money sort of slipping through our fingers, and we'll have to make a conscious effort to deal with 8th house matters, insurance, taxes, estate planning, each other's resources. We'll have to make an effort to deal with those things in a way that brings clarity to that area of life, where we can really see the sharp edges of what we've got. With composite Neptune in the 9th house, we tend to romanticize and idealize each other's philosophies and ideals. We idealize our ideals. And it can be a very beautiful place for Neptune to be. We can, want to travel more. We can want to learn together. We can romanticize religion and how we go after our political ideals. And it can make us much more tolerant of our philosophical or moral differences as well. We can even see those as irrelevant to the relationship. For some couples, if they have fanaticism in their natal charts, if we have Neptune in the ninth, it can increase that. We can become very zealous about our beliefs, and that can be a point of confusion. We can just be all in when it comes to our combined religion or spirituality, and that itself can be very blinding, although we can believe that we have ultimate clarity. So we have to be careful about how we're influencing each other's religious or spiritual ideals. With composite Neptune in the 10th house, it can make it very hard to know where the relationship is going. What is it that we are going towards? What do we want to create? What are the bones of the relationship? So there can be just a combined confusion, or just even never having had a real concrete talk or discussion about where we're going or what we're doing, because there's just more assuming or glossing over in that department. So there isn't a lot of confrontation that happens when it comes to the future. The other thing that happens is that we don't tend to look at the potentials of what we're getting into realistically. So there's some self-transcendence that often happens with Neptune in the composite 10th house. We can put our own needs or ego requirements on the back burner so the other person can achieve or can go after what they want. That's another expression of Neptune in the composite 10th house. So there can be like a personal ego transcendence that happens, and the other person is largely unaware of it. They are just the beneficiary of it. But it's an interesting placement, because there can be quite a lot of confusion that happens, but if we have enough to do with each other, one of the partners can end up achieving a type of very valuable personal clarity as a result of how they have had to sacrifice in order for the other person to achieve their own 10th house goals or their own 10th house ends. Neptune in the composite 11th is a fairly harmless place. It's where we are most accepting and idealistic, and that it's coming into an area of life where we are very tolerant and also idealistic, but in a more humanitarian, less spiritual way. So there tends to be a lot of forgiveness, farsightedness. There can be confusion in the area of what are our hopes or our dreams, but it doesn't seem to be something that contributes extremely negatively to the relationship. There's can be some assuming that we want a lot of the same things, but in many, many cases, those assumptions actually were pretty darn accurate. So there's more of just an acceptance at large of who the other person is, even though we can idealize and romanticize. When the truth comes out, there does tend to be an appreciation for the actual real qualities of each other, even though we were previously unaware of them. So the companionship that we can find with each other is the real treasure with Neptune in the composite 11th. With composite Neptune in the 12th house, we are more willing to show our secrets and to tell our secrets. We feel that the other person's going to accept what it is that's hidden, and we want to explore what's hidden between the two of us, and especially to reveal that to each other. So it can contribute in some cases to more extreme escapism, but you would want to look at that and see, is that present in the natal chart, in both natal charts? And because we will be bringing that out within each other. Usually that's going to have to be present in both natal charts to be a thing. But typically, this is Neptune's home. Neptune belongs in the 12th house. So it's a non-troublesome placement for most partnerships. And compassion, the ability to speak our secrets, and to feel that there is a selfless acceptance, that can all be a part of composite Neptune in the 12th house. If we have Neptune in aspect to hard, difficult aspect to personal planets, if we have a lot of Neptune going on, and then it comes in confusing Neptune, a fairy Neptune going on, and the Neptune comes into the 12th, then it is much, much more likely that we will experience a hidden or affair type situation. But in itself, Neptune in the 12th house is actually a pretty darn good thing to have. I hope that was helpful. If it was, please subscribe to my channel. You can find me on the internet at truthinAspectAstrology.com, other social media at Truth in Aspect Astrology. I am currently teaching full-time, so my schedule has opened up for a very, very limited amount of clients, but check back into the future because that should open more as the new year comes along. And I will be back super soon with more super cool videos. Bye-bye.